It's time now for Harm Reduction, heard every Tuesday at 7 p.m. with Will Beaton, Cutting Edge Radio, where we'll ask the questions others don't want to ask. Now here's your host, Will Beaton.
Hello everybody, it is Willard T. Belly, reporting live once again from the Firebreak Farm here in Grass Valley, California. It is our 24th episode, and while I am still here in California, I felt strongly that I wanted to continue to do this California Perspectives thing. And what struck me most about my trip out here, I left G-Funk a few weeks ago, was that I was here just in time to attend the memorial services for two elders in the psychedelic research community who have recently died. In the last two episodes, we talked about those people. The first was John Perry Barlow, who founded the Electronic Frontier Foundation and wrote lyrics for the Grateful Dead and all kinds of other things. And the other was Dale Pendell, who I went to his memorial up on San Juan Ridge the other day and learned about his involvement, especially writing the Pharmaco books about psychoactive plants and their relationship with humans and stuff. Very interesting. Well, there's another person that I'm curious about that all of these people cite as somebody who is important to them in their research career and becoming inspired to be an active individual in this community. And that person is Alexander and Ann Shulgin. Ann and Alexander Shulgin, they together, you might call power couple, one of the coolest. They wrote some books together, including, especially the big ones, PiHKAL and TiHKAL. That is PiHKAL, and it stands for Phenethylamines I Have Known and Loved, a chemical love story. And the sequel, TiHKAL, Tryptamines I Have Known and Loved. The continuation, both these books by Alexander and Ann Shulgin. Basically what they're doing is they're creating new substances and essentially testing them out on themselves and taking very rigorous scientific academic data about all of these chemicals and their effects and their usefulness in therapeutic counseling settings. And it was one of the first ever books that attempted to do this. In the first one, there are 179 different substances, and this review I'm reading here says perhaps mentions of 150 more. But these things are all documented like a scientist would know about it. This guy, Sasha Alexander, was a chemist, and there's a fun little clip of him that they played at his memorial a couple years ago when he died that I'm going to run at the end of this whole episode to give you an idea. And he talks about alchemy and being an alchemist, and he has a really fun way of perceiving what alchemy as an art and as a discipline is, and it's very interesting, and maybe you'll enjoy that. So the Shulgins, they created a lot of the chemicals that people use now, and it was very important work, and everybody knows them. So Sasha Alexander died a few years ago, and I since I'm in the mood here, I guess, about listening to people's memorials, I was just looking around for stuff on the Shulgins, and I found on the Internet Archive, actually, archive.org, I typed in Shulgin, and found Alexander Shulgin's memorial video. It's about an hour and a half, and what I've done is I watched it and I chunked out all the empty space and tightened it up a little bit. So I think what I'm going to do this episode here, I really want to give my last full episode here in California dedicated to the Shulgins, because they were some of the first people on my mind when I first arrived here, and now why not, while I'm still trying to cover a bunch of these, or as many of these elders' perspectives as I can in this research world, it seems to make sense to dedicate a full episode, a full hour here to the Shulgins. So what I want to do actually is I've got about a 25-minute clip of Ann speaking back in the 90s, and then another about 25-minute clip of Sasha speaking, also, I believe, in the 90s, I think. And I want to show you first Ann, because the difference between Ann and Sasha is that Ann is alive. And Ann, from what my friend Annie Oak tells me, is probably the number one top psychedelic woman, at least in the United States. The top woman who's involved in the community and who's actively putting in to the community, building it up with knowledge, expanding her own legacy to incorporate itself and give benefit to that whole community she's a part of. And the clip I found on the Internet Archive of Ann speaking is a lecture of hers she's giving entitled The Shadow, or she'll explain in the beginning, actually, the shadow as it relates to psychedelic healing. So she describes some of her original efforts to do underground illegal therapy for people using these now recently then scheduled substances. And she describes her initial success at using psychedelic medicines with people in a very chill therapeutic setting, and they're able to have really important breakthroughs with people and stuff. And now today, MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, is doing phase 3 MDMA trials with MDMA. MDMA is one of these compounds that the Shulgin was responsible for inventing again, for rediscovering and bringing to the world. And so now MAPS today, this big nonprofit group, is getting these things legal. Well, getting this therapy legal. Well, rewind, and Ann here, while it was these substances were just then becoming illegal in the 60s and 70s, she was the first one of the first people to be doing these underground therapies. So it's her talking about the stigma associated with this work, because it's not even legal for her to do, but she's doing it anyway. And then we're going to cut to a clip of Alexander Shulgin, and I really like how he starts out his thing. The Dr. Hoffman he's referring to, of course, is Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD 75 years ago in Switzerland. Thank you, Switzerland. Jeez. And he's describing his reluctance to be giving the lecture that he's giving, I think, to a group of college students, because he's a chemist and he's sort of shy, and I think he's speaking at some sort of philosophy-based school, or maybe even a divinity or spirituality school or something. I'm not sure, but the name of his talk is "Why I Do What I Do," and so it's not just his straight-up chemistry talk. Which, if you're a chemist out there, you should look this guy up and see what he's done, because it's all very fascinating stuff, whether you're into what he's making or not. It's very amazing how he made it. The Shulgins did this to protect the public's right to know and access information about these substances. They are doing it very much in the spirit of absolute freedom, and freedom for the people to decide to learn about whatever they want to learn about. His laboratory was famously raided in 1994 by the DEA. And I'm just reading here that one of the DEA spokesman people at the time said, "It is our opinion that those books are pretty much cookbooks on how to make illegal drugs. Agents tell me that in clandestine labs that they have raided, they have found copies of these books." So the police at the time were taking the stance that, like you just said, this information about these substances should be illegal for people to possess. And the Shulgins basically totally disagree on that point. Not only do the Shulgins disagree that these things should not be illegal at all, but they're interested in the public's right to have access to this knowledge. And they put themselves at extreme personal risk and danger. They're very courageous in what they did in order to collect this information and then to publish it. And that's the funny thing is most of these books, all the information now is available free on erowid.org. That's EROWID, erowid.org. I met the folks, their name is Erowid, who run the site and who started the site. They were at both the memorial for Dale Pendell. I saw them at the memorial for John Perry Barlow. And I see that they spoke at the memorial of Alexander Shulgin a few years ago. And so the episode today of the Harm Reduction Report is going to be first showing this clip of Ann talking about the early pioneering days of this illegal psychedelic therapy. And then Sasha Shulgin talking about why he does what he does in very dramatic, wonderful words and his own words. And then, if you're listening online, keqqradio.com or 88.3 FM in good old G-Funk, the episode will end there. However, if you are listening on the Sandbagger News YouTube channel or finding these videos posted on the UND Psychedelic Club Facebook page, you will notice that the video for you is about an hour and a half longer because you're going to get to watch, if you want, the whole edited memorial service for Alexander Shulgin when he died a few years ago. So check it out if you like. This is the Harm Reduction Report. Thank you so much. Sandbag on. See you next time.
We're going now from the outside world to the inside world. And this is called Psychedelics in the Shadow. It's actually more psychedelic therapy and the shadow. A long time ago, in a place far away, he's from Jamaica, I worked for about 3 years as a lay therapist. For 2 of those 3 years, I became the partner of a very skilled hypnotherapist. I joined her about twice a week when we would guide one or another of her patients through a session with mostly MDMA. With certain patients, after some time and much hard work, we would give them a session with 2CB or perhaps LSD or mescaline, depending upon what the patient needed and wanted. All this took place before MDMA or 2CB were scheduled. LSD and mescaline, however, were already illegal, so this was not what you would call out in the open therapy. This was at a time when a great many of the more innovative therapists were trying MDMA out with their patients, with certain of their patients, and we were urging all of them to publish as soon as possible. And of course they wanted to take their time because this was not generally approved medical practice, with the result that when all of a sudden the government declared that MDMA was going to be scheduled, nobody had put anything on paper. And so it was very easy for the government to declare this a Schedule I drug because there was high abuse potential and obviously no medical utility. Nobody had published on any medical utility, so that was a sad thing to have happen. In case you're wondering, the frequency of MDMA use in these sessions varied considerably. For some patients, one session seemed to be all they needed. This is, I would say, not frequent, but more often than you would think. The patient would be tremendously satisfied with one experience and simply didn't particularly need to have another one. A single experience gave them all they wished to have, or reach, or accomplish. But for others, one session a month for several months, or once every 6 weeks, would allow them to complete their insight work. The single session with a true psychedelic, remember that MDMA is not a real psychedelic drug. One exposure to 2CB or another of the classic psychedelics was usually given toward the end of the therapy. For one patient, it might break open images and emotions held deep in the unconscious, which had to be brought up to consciousness for there to be resolution. For another person, this single session would be a kind of graduation ceremony, a celebration after long and difficult work. Now, those 3 years were a time of intense learning for me. Every patient or client was a completely new universe, and I had to learn almost as much about myself and my own psychological barriers as I did about those of the patient. The learning about myself had to happen very fast, on the spot, so to speak, because what was at stake was my ability to do my job, and often the patient's trust in me as a guide. I'll give just one example for the moment, which is certainly not myself, but very well could be another therapist. Let's say the therapist has been brought up as a church-going Catholic, or even a Methodist for that matter, and the patient begins talking about memories of a previous life. The therapist's mind is going to stumble over what the patient is saying, and suddenly there are going to be a lot of conflicting thoughts getting in the way of her ability to hear and tune into the patient's story. She will have to spend a bit of time reminding herself that her own belief system has no place in the therapy situation, and that she must remain completely unjudgmental and accepting of the patient's truth. Not only that, she has to be sure that her feelings toward the patient are not clouded by deep-seated negative judgments, which are inherited from a childhood that might have been, steeped in religious teachings, which emphasize the error of such concepts as reincarnation. Now, the only way I know of to avoid this kind of problem is constant practice of an attitude that might be described as, no matter what I hear from my patient, I will open myself to his world and his beliefs, as well as his feelings and emotions. And I'll put aside any inclination to decide the wrongness or rightness of his views, until much later, when we'll work together to evaluate what works in his life and what doesn't work. I'm talking here about therapy, but a lot of you may find yourself, or may already have found yourself, in a situation where, because you may have lived long enough and you have some sort of ability and interest in this sort of thing, people start coming to you for sessions, and so you too can find yourself being a lay therapist without realizing that that's what was going to happen. But I'm presenting it as more of a sort of established therapeutic practice. By the end of my third year doing this kind of therapy, I come to realize that the most important part of the process was working with the shadow. I think you've all heard of what Carl Jung calls the shadow. The term most often used in the society at large is the dark side. I think it's safe to say that this shadow aspect of the human psyche, while it remains unconscious, can be blamed for all wars, from tribal conflicts to battles between great nations. It causes racial prejudice. It underlies jealousy and resentment. You're seeing the human shadow in every vampire and werewolf movie, and its face is the face of a very popular figure called the devil or Satan. In our present time, we have Darth Vader. However, there's a difference between Darth Vader and the earlier demonic figures, in that Darth Vader was created by a filmmaker who understood what he represented. After all, George Lucas was a student of Joseph Campbell. However, when work on the shadow is underway, when it begins to drift toward conscious awareness, it carries with it gifts for its owner. To give you a brief clue to what I mean, think about the great works of art, in painting and music, for instance, and recognize that pure light and beauty, sweetness and gentleness by themselves will give pleasure only for a short time. For what we experience as greatness, and fullness, and authenticity, there needs to be an edge, a touch of darkness, a bittersweetness, even a shade of sadness or pain contained in the work. Remember, all this time, a part of him, the patient, believes that this shadow monster, this horrid, putrid, evil beast, is actually the bedrock identity, the real essence of who and what he is. So I believe that this process takes more courage than just about anything else anyone could ever expect to be asked to do in his life. That's why his therapist must have undergone this experience herself. Only someone who's made the same journey can be believed when she tells her patient that, quote, what you'll see is not your true self. It is part of you, certainly, but it's not what you truly are. Once you're inside it, you'll discover that there's no more fear. The only thing your shadow is afraid of is being discovered. It prefers to stay in the dark where it can keep its power. Once you've found it and stepped inside, you'll feel only power and total lack of fear, unquote. Or she'll say something like that. And that's actually what happens. There's no more fear inside there. It's just this great power. So, when does the princely transformation take place? It begins at the point where you find yourself looking out the monster's eyes, which is also the point at which you forget to be afraid. When you've reached that place, you can step outside the beast again and go back up the stair because you have nothing to be afraid of anymore. What is there to fear? This confrontation with the shadow usually takes a long time, several days of intense work. However, I have seen it happen, I think it's twice, in one day. I think we were using MDMA, and the person, the patient was a very positive-minded, optimistic kind of person. She or he, I think it was one of each. They're the kind of people who just didn't let things get them down in life, I love people like that. Wish I were one. And they somehow managed to discover enough courage to actually do that whole thing in one single day. It was long days, I remember. Probably closer to 8 to 10 hours. But it can be done. But most people take quite a few sessions. It usually takes several days of intense work. And of course, it isn't finished until you've gone back and gone back yet again to look at the shadow monster, who will be shrinking in size and beginning to look quite different. No longer hairy and probably without his sharp teeth, so to speak. The process is not truly finished until you have, with the help of your therapist, learned to feel compassion, then affection for your shadow beast, if you remember the fairy tale. The compassion is not so terribly difficult once your therapist helps to point out that all of this shadow form took place because of things that were told to you, done to you, that you are not responsible for this, that you dealt with all of this rejection and repression the only way you could. And that it is important as the patient to look back on the completely vulnerable child you were, and how helpless you felt, and how completely lacking in understanding you were about these things that you were being told were bad. So after a while, you can begin to feel a bit of compassion for this hard self thing. Feeling love for it, it takes a little longer. But eventually it will happen. Now, how and in what way does the transformed shadow become your ally? Well, if you faced aspects of yourself that you used to be ashamed of and try to deny, you will be able to deliberately decide whether or not to make use of any of these aspects at certain times in your life. To give a relatively minor and benign example, when I sit down at a chessboard, I can give myself permission to turn on my aggressive side. No more Mrs. Nice Guy. And if my opponent doesn't like it, to hell with him. That's just tough. Or more seriously, if I find myself walking a dark street in a strange city and hear footsteps behind me, I don't have to hesitate before I become my growling big cat killer self. It's okay. My killer is there to be used if he's needed. The difference is that I'm not in danger of being taken over by one of these aspects of my shadow without my consent, and perhaps under the wrong circumstances, which is what happens when it remains unconscious. I can make conscious choices about whether to use my darker ally or not. Now, having worked with a hypnotherapist as a co-therapist for 2 of my 3 years doing this sort of work, I have tremendous respect for and faith in hypnotic trance as a tool for this kind of work. We used MDMA for most of the work, and it seemed to do very well with the hypnotic state. Her patients had already gone through 6 months to a year of hypnotherapy with her, and they all knew how to induce the trance state. What MDMA brought to the situation was its magical way of allowing insight while eliminating self-rejection. I don't think there is any other drug known that will do that in that way. This is what you have to begin with if you're going to do shadow work. Insight into your darker side, but without self-hatred and without shame. Very hard to manage for most of us. And MDMA is the only drug I know of that can show you how to open up that way of feeling toward yourself. Acceptance of all the things you are, with love and compassion. As for the duration of each session when you're doing shadow work, it's pretty much the same as when you're doing so-called psychedelic therapy that isn't mainly shadow work, which is a minimum of 6 hours if you're using MDMA, and up to 8 hours if you're using the other best therapy drug, the real psychedelic 2CB. Sadly, they're now both illegal in the U.S., though 2CB held out for a long time. My hypnotherapist friend and I use the term intensives to describe such sessions. They also could have been called the long sessions. One of the unbreakable rules was that if a patient got into an interior struggle at about the time the session would ordinarily have come to a close, which sometimes happens, those of you who have little kids know that the most riveting and important questions are asked just before bedtime, and then you've got a long hour or so of very careful, delicate talking ahead of you. The same thing happens in therapy sometimes. One of the unbreakable rules was that if a patient got into an interior struggle, we kept going, no matter how long it took, especially with shadow work, we would not close down until the patient had worked through whatever he was confronting and had come out the other side. You cannot do the classic 15-minute hour with this sort of work. There's no question of doing that. Now, this didn't happen often, but it did mean an occasional 8 to 10 hour day. You can't take too many of those in a row, but they don't happen that often. But the rule has to be maintained. If there's something important in progress, you do not cut it short. There's no excuse for doing that. I wouldn't hesitate to recommend doing shadow work with hypnosis only. Now MDMA and drugs like 2CB aren't available. Hypnosis can open the same psychic doors as the drugs. It may take a bit longer to bring the patient to a point where he can allow himself to feel acceptance and compassion for his shadow self, but it can be done. It will still take a therapist who has done that work herself, however. The Buddhists teach that immediately after death, the soul will meet demonic figures known as, I think it's guardians of the gate. I don't know whether it's at the gate or off the gate, but off, okay. And that he must keep in mind that they are all aspects of himself, and that he cannot move ahead into the spiritual world until he has acknowledged and embraced them, until he has owned them, which is another way of reminding us that spiritual wholeness requires that we accept and own all parts of ourselves, and that we must find a way to love all that we are, and eventually to love all that other living things are, rejecting none. I don't know whether it was Oscar Wilde or somebody before him who made that wonderful statement, which came up in the middle of a Northern Exposure. If you remember Northern Exposure, that was the quotation is, "Nothing human is alien to me." That's what we have to get to. The closest most of us will come to looking in the eyes of God is when we look at the face of a newborn baby. Look in the eyes of a newborn is quite an experience. And what does the newborn show us? All the possibilities for light and dark, good and evil, love and hate. The potential is there for everything and anything that a human being can be. Now, those of us who have used psychedelics to achieve, greater consciousness have sometimes managed to understand just a little bit that the great mind we call God, if we believe in such a thing, contains all things, all dualities, all opposites, all light and all darkness. The difficult part of that is that some psychedelic travelers, like some non-psychedelic travelers in these realms, also come back and state that everything that exists is contained in love, which makes no sense whatsoever, but it seems to be part of the truth. In doing work to bring our own shadow selves into awareness, and in finding that we can feel compassion for our dark, twisted, ugly aspects, thereby transforming them, we might come a little closer to understanding, not with the mind, but with the heart, what is meant by that otherwise incomprehensible phrase, God is love.
There was a meeting last year when Dr. Hoffman came, and his opening sentence was, "You expected the shaman, you're going to get a chemist." When I was first asked by Dr. Robert Gordon McCutcheon to come here tonight and talk about whatever I wanted to do, my first impression, as long as I allowed my first impression, was to decline. I had, after all, I am a student of chemistry and of pharmacology and not really a student of philosophy and religion. And I felt I had probably contributed as much as I could last year when I took chalk to blackboard and drew hexagons and tryptamine rings and gave my impression of what on a molecule caused it to do what. But my wife intervened. Why not tell them just why you do what you do? It got me launched into an interesting question. I never had actually spoken to myself and said, why do you do what you do? The flippant answer is always at hand. Well, one does it because it's there to be done. The Mount Everest routine. I climb the mountain because it's there to be climbed. But that is, of course, not the reason I do the research I do. Whenever this question would come up in a seminar or during a panel discussion, I'd place special emphasis on the word psychotomimetic. The word has been used quite a bit today. A term that is usually used by the scientific community when they wish to speak about the psychedelic drugs. The term psychedelic does not find a good audience in the psychiatric or in the chemical or in the medical literature. It carries a meta-message of drug use, drug encouragement, drug proselytizing, and as a result, the word's not often encountered. In its origin, as was pointed out, it comes from psychoto, meaning in essence psychosis, and mimesis, meaning the imitation of. And this indeed is a term that very early in the work in this area that had been given these materials because they had been cast in the role of causing syndrome, causing symptoms that would reflect the character of mental illness. And it's felt by studying the effects of these materials in normal subjects, you might be able to glean some insight as to the mechanisms or at least the descriptions and definitions of this syndrome when seen in people who are spontaneously ill. This explanation, the search for new psychotomimetics, for materials that would be more exacting in definition of psychosis, is completely logical in that most of the hallucinogenics, the psychedelics that are known, can be classified into materials that are indoles, and there are many in this area, the tryptamines, the more convoluted carbolines, LSD as an ergot-type indole, or it can be classified as phenethylamines. And there are perhaps some 3 or 4 score that are in this classification. The analogs of mescaline compound that's been mentioned several times, or the substitution variants of mescaline, or the alpha-methyl compounds that have given rise to the materials that are lumped chemically together as the amphetamines. And there are 2 principal neurotransmitters in the brain. One is an indole, and this is serotonin. One is a phenethylamine, namely dopamine. And it's very desirable from the point of the neurochemist to find pigeonholes that can classify things. Here we have a group of psychedelics that are all indoles, and we have a neurotransmitter that's indolic, serotonin. Here's a group that are all phenethylamines, and we have a neurotransmitter that's a phenethylamine. All we have to do is understand why all of these work here and all of those work there, and we shall now know how the neurotransmitters work in the brain. And once we know that, we'll be able to cure mental illness. Well, it's an appealing, and it has not been a particularly rewarding classification. And the explanation, beside being logical, is quite safe, because it's an unthreatening explanation. It's easily accepted by the academic and the administrative community. But the explanation is still not the explanation of why I do what I do. My work is indeed dedicated to the development of tools, but tools for quite a different purpose. And here's where I want to get quite away from chemistry and into some of my own personal thoughts. I'd like to lay a little background to establish a framework for these tools, and in part to define them, and in part to give emphasis to an urgency that I really feel associated with them. First, I am a very firm believer in the reality of a balance in all aspects of the human theater. When there seems to be a development, a move that-a-way, somehow, very shortly, or almost in concert, there is a move this-a-way that keeps things in some delicate balance. If there must be a dichotomization of concepts into good and evil, then all good seems to contain its unexpressed evil, and all evil is unexpressed good. Within the human mind, there coexists the eros, the life-loving, the self-perpetrating force, with the thanatos, the self-destructive death wish. Both are present in each of us, but are usually separated by a very difficult wall, a very difficult to penetrate wall, the unconscious. One definition of the tools I seek is that they may allow words of a vocabulary which might allow each human being to more consciously and more clearly communicate with the interior of his own mind and psyche. This may be called a vocabulary of awareness. A person who becomes increasingly aware of, and so begins to acknowledge, the existence of the two opposite contributors to his motives and decisions may begin to make choices which are knowledgeable. And the learning process that follows such choices is the path that leads to wisdom. Another coincidence in timing, which in retrospect started a dividing of science onto separate paths, occurred during World War II. In the late 1942, Enrico Fermi and several other scientists at the University of Chicago demonstrated for the first time ever that nuclear fission could be achieved and could be controlled by man. The age of unlimited power and freedom from dependency upon our dwindling fossil reserves had begun. Just the next year, at 4:20 p.m. on the 19th of April, Albert Hofmann consumed a measured amount of a compound which he had first synthesized some 5 years earlier. As Hofmann subsequently reported, as a quotation following 250 micrograms, after the crisis of confusion and despair, I began to enjoy the unprecedented colors and plays of shapes that persisted. Kaleidoscopic, fantastic images surged in on me, alternating, variegated, opening and closing themselves in circles and spirals. LSD had also been discovered. But then, still, and up until the last decade, it was the rich promise of the nuclear age, first with the power and potential of fission, and later with the virtually limitless potential of fusion energy, that carried the banner and the hopes of man. And the area of the hallucinogenics was categorized as negative, psychosis imitating, psychotomimetic. It was not until sometime in the 1970s, that a strange and a fascinating and a rather frightening reversal of roles had took place. The knowledge of nuclear fission and fusion took on a death-loving aspect, with country after country joining the fraternity of those skilled in the capacity for the eradication of the human experiment. And to have such power leads to the threat to use such power, which in time will actually lead to its use. But, as I said earlier, when one thing develops, there seems to spring forth a compensatory counterpart. This balance can be realized with the psychedelic drugs. What had been simply tools for the study of psychosis at best, or for escapist self-gratification at worst, suddenly assume the character of tools of enlightenment and of some form of transcendental communication. If man's alter ego, his thanatos, had been entrusted with the imperpetual knowledge of how he can completely destroy himself and this extraordinary experiment, then some development must occur at the eros side of his psyche that will and must afford the learning of how to live with this professional knowledge. It is a communication between these two sides of the mind that requires an extraordinary vocabulary. Where do these words come from, the words of this vocabulary? All depend upon an intimate insight into the working of the human mind, but this can be approached in many ways. The study of religion, of meditation, of self-yielding, provides a peace, but in my mind also tends toward a retreat and hence a capitulation. The efforts to amalgamate the two sides of the mind, as seen in the Tao of Physics, and the rich findings of parallelisms between the Eastern and Western philosophies may eventually explain all and allow some unification for the human purpose. But I feel, along with many others, that the efforts being invested in the technology of destruction does not allow sufficient time. It is possibly only with the psychedelic drugs that words of vocabulary can be established which might tunnel through the subconscious between the conflicting aspects of the mind and psyche. It is here that I feel my skill lies. And this is exactly why I do what I do. Where do we stand as of today? In the last handful of years, the forces of government and nationalism have amassed an unprecedented arsenal of destructive power. The power is in the current arsenals of the world, if restructured into Hiroshima-strength weapons, to detonate one bomb every minute, on the minute, for the next 2 years. And the rationalized need to do so is becoming manifest at a frightening pace. But in the last handful of years, a number of tools of communication have increased at a like rate. There are currently nearly 200 psychedelic drugs known and described, some touching at one, some at another of the fibers that unify our minds. By learning each of their structures of sensory communication in turn, we might find a form of communication that would disarm our destructive compulsion. And indeed, what form of tools are now available to us? Some of the tools that are available, or rather that have been available, are the widely publicized drugs of psychopharmacology, such as mescaline, psilocybin, DOM, LSD. These drugs played a role in defining the transition between drugs as entertainment, escape, turn on, and drugs as instructive vehicles for learning, enlightenment, and insight, but at quite a price. They had a high profile at the time that the scheduled drug laws were written, and thus were made illegal and are not available. However, in their place there are now many, many other materials, some more limited in their instructive capacity, and some perhaps even richer. And for every one today, there will be 10 tomorrow. Let me describe a small sampling of the recently born materials a bit more in detail. These are examples with some quotations in some instances of experiments in which there have been actually definitions of some aspect of sensory teasing apart of the complex sensorium attack and effects that these materials can have. DIPT is an abbreviation of N-diisopropyltryptamine, a drug unique among the psychedelics in that it expresses a distortion in, or to an extent, a synthesis with the process of auditory integrity. It is perhaps one of the less available senses to be teased apart for special study. Many of the close relatives, as you well know, deal with the visual process and in some way will change or synthesize or modify the visual integrity, but a rather interesting distinction between the drug-induced psychosis and endogenous schizophrenia is that very often in the latter, the primary sensory character that is affected is the auditory influence. A quotation following 20 milligrams of DIPT. The telephone sounds partly underwater. Here are signs of a pitch change on radio. The absolute pitch down a major third. Chord on the piano sounds out of tune, quite flat. Music terrible, unlistenable. The other senses seem in no way affected. If I were deaf, I would have thought this an inactive drug. Several hours after ingestion of the material, this note: hearing normal, piano back in tune. MDMA, or MDA, is abbreviation for 3,4-methylene-dioxy-methamphetamine. It's a tool of communication that has shown, in recent years, an extraordinary utility in opening communication between individuals. This has promoted its use in psychotherapy, but has given promise as well as a vehicle for intrapersonal communication. This particular drug has been used clinically in many applications, and these today in probably number in the thousands. And it has commanded a remarkably good record of positive results. A quotation following 120 milligrams. We kept up a lively conversation covering many interesting aspects of our various family relationships. The conversation was unusually insightful and free of defensiveness. And following a 40 milligram supplement at the 2-hour point, Jean glowed with energy, became very beautiful. We talked freely and openly. Every bush and plant looks utterly alive. I am entranced by a large rock. As I look at its surface, I see the surface of a planet with mountains and valleys. Little crystals of mica are like jewels. Another material, 2CB, is the abbreviation for 2,5-dimethoxy-4-bromophenethylamine. A tool and a word of vocabulary which ties the mental process directly and constructively into the physical soma. The analgesic effects experienced with many, if not most, of the psychedelic drugs are not present with 2CB. On the contrary, there is an increased body awareness of every kind, including skin sensitivity, heightened responsiveness to smells, tastes, to sexual stimulation. One experiences increased consciousness of physical health and energy, or, on the other hand, sharpened awareness of any body imbalance or discomfort. 2CB allows rich visual imagery and intense eyes-closed fantasy without cluttering up of the mental field with too many elaborations. A quotation following 20 milligrams. Along with the awareness of the body and the ability to deeply enjoy the fact that one is a physical as well as a spiritual being, the experience of 2CB allows exploration as far as one needs to go. There is at all times full connection with all parts of oneself, the emotional and the intellectual, the intuitive and the instinctual. It is a superb tool for learning and for growth. And 2CB allows one to recover baseline within 6 to 8 hours using a maximum dosage of 25 milligrams, usually lower in the area of 18 to 20. Another drug mentioned earlier, ketamine, is abbreviation for 2-orthochlorophenyl 2-methylaminocyclohexanone, the antithesis of 2CB, in that it effectively separates the mind and the body. This allows the mind a separate and constructive state, apart from the physical groundings of the body. Although the primary clinical application of ketamine is as a dissociative anesthetic, an increasingly important direction of study is now being directed to the psychological loosening that it allows. MAL and CPM are abbreviations of the compounds that are fascinating analogs of mescaline, namely 4-methyl-3,5-dimethoxyphenethylamine and 4-cyclopropylmethyl-3,5-dimethoxyphenethylamine. Two compounds that activate opposite sides of the sensorium. The former provokes an intense visual distortion at the retinal level with consequential bizarre interpretations. The latter displays its effectiveness in the fantasy counterpart, seen only with the eyes closed. Following 65 milligrams of MAL, a quotation, within 2 hours, intense effect, beautiful, diuretic, good connections between parts of myself, continual fantasy and imagery, lovely experience of the erotic with husband. Around 12 hours, excellent solid sleep with clear, balanced dreams. Following 70 milligrams of CPM, at 2 hours, strong effect but no visual. Wonderful locking into music, deep loving, erotic, very good. With eyes closed, intense, colorful fantasy, much like LSD at times. No sleep before 18 hours. Anyone should have the impression, by the way, that research in this area leads always to God and to insight and to deeper experiences in loving. Let me mention an example of a compound called 4-TASB, which is 4-thioethyl-3-ethoxy-5-methoxyphenethylamine. Following 100 milligram exposure. At about 2 hours, pleasant and positive, peaceful feelings, very good humored. Later, sleep impossible until early morning, and then only about 2 hours. All next day could not rest or sleep. Feeling of nerve endings raw and active, anxiety over heartbeat. Frightening effects on nervous system. Depression, back of neck sore from tension. My first experience of being able to detect what felt like continual electrical impulses between nerve endings. Had the impression that if I allowed the wrong sequence of images to flow in my mind, I might experience some sort of convulsion, or at least a kind of mental shock or shorting out. When I tried to sleep, eyes closed fantasies became intensely negative and threatening. I could not smooth out the nervous system. Felt very vulnerable. Do not repeat. Alpha-O-DMS is abbreviation of 5-methoxy-alpha-methyltryptamines, an analog of a neurotransmitter serotonin that has been tailored chemically to allow it to enter into the CNS, into the brain. It is a very potent indole psychedelic that touches closely on those areas involved with primal energies. Several researchers experienced dreams of catastrophic events after exploring this material. One researcher, however, had a dream which involved as a complete science fiction scenario. He found it absolutely enjoyable and is still thinking of writing it up and sending it into a publisher. These are only about a half a dozen or so of many scores of fascinating compounds that are now available for the study of this developing vocabulary. This is where we are at the moment. Some materials show incredible promise, and some suggest caution. But what might we expect to emerge in the future? Let's look at the past history of other areas of psychotropic chemistry. A few decades ago, it was marveled at that drugs such as the opiates, including morphine and heroin, meperidine, could have such an exacting influence on the brain's integrity. Then it became known that there were natural factors in the brain that had these actions, and that there were specific sites in the brain that were pre-designed to respond to them. There were the enkephalins and their fragmented portions known as the endorphins, which were derived from the cephalic process and related to morphine. These met a person's need for the suppression of pain. Perhaps there are enkadelics from the psychedelics, and specific N-escalins from mescaline yet to be discovered that might relate to these communicative factors, which might be the natural which might be connected and eventually related to the natural receptor sites in the brain for transcendental communication. Their structures may someday be known. Their functions may someday be understood. There are a multitude of tenuous threads that tie together the fragile structure of the human spirit. The life-giving with the death-demanding side. The exalted voice with the mundane. The strongly centered self with the drive toward dispersion and loss of center. These all coexist in all of us, but there is an essential blockade between these inner worlds which I truly feel can be penetrated only with the words and the tools and the understanding that may be most easily obtained through the area of psychedelic experiences. William Blake said in The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, "Man has no body distinct from his soul, for that called body is a portion of soul, discerned by the five senses. The chief inlets of soul in this age, energy is the only life and is from the body, and reason is the bound or outward circumference of energy. Energy is eternal delight." These are responses to a heartfelt need for some vocabulary, to allow the establishment of a dialogue that might diffuse the accelerating mad moves toward extinction. My personal philosophy might well be lifted directly from Blake. I must create a system or be slaved by another man's. I may be wrong, but I must do what I'm doing. And I will do what I can as fast as I can.
Alchemy, I've always taken the word al is, I believe, from the Arabic, meaning the, as in algebra and alchemy would be the chemistry. But it to me is something that was in the 1600s. And I've always, people give it credit for having evolved the structure of chemistry. But to me, I've always looked upon it as a form of meditation. Because people would do something and they distill it and condense it and re-condense it down to where it started, as if they were purifying, then they would do it again. And then they would do it again, as if they were using this as a background for meditation. And my belief is alchemy was really a form of meditation. Am I an alchemist? In a sense, yes, because I look upon myself as participating in this very fundamental meditative search. I've taken chemistry basically as an art or a music form. To me, chemistry is an active putting together of things that have never been put together before in sequences that are strange and new, exactly as music is putting together notes and concepts and phrases in ways that have never been done before, or art for that matter, where you put strokes on a canvas that have never been put there before. And chemistry is exactly that type of form. Very few chemists feel that way because they are in the idea of they're primarily in the process of finding a goal, make a product, develop something and work toward that. If you don't succeed and if something goes wrong, try another method. That's modern chemistry. To me, go toward a goal. If something goes wrong, learn from what goes wrong And you'll be a much richer imagination, have a much richer imagination the next time around. I love the idea of process because you can go wrong and discover new things totally. Science is the search for what's around you and what everything means. And if indeed your vocabulary is one of spirituality, then the finding out what's around you involves spirituality, and it is a science of its time. Science is a discipline and as a search for answers to questions, and spirituality as a way of accepting things as they are and learning from that. So they're actually coming from different directions today, but I believe at that time they were indeed the same question. Psychedelic chemistry may represent a reintegration of the search for spirituality, or the acceptance of spirituality, which is the soul, the spirit, the individual, and the science, which is the chemistry and the development of catalysts that release this aspect of spirituality.
My name is Bob Jesse. I'm one of many people who have felt a call to gather in community to pay tribute to Sasha. On behalf of the Shulgin family, welcome and thank you for being here. I invite us to begin with some brief reflections, with your eyes closed, if you like. First, can you bring to mind a specific time when you interacted with Sasha, saw him speak, read his work, or the time when you heard of his death? If you've taken one of Sasha's compounds or a similar substance, as I have, can you bring to mind an especially influential occasion? What has that experience brought to you? Can you imagine how your life might have unfolded differently without it? And can you imagine what a world might look like where such experiences, suitably contained and supported, were widely available? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Amanda, and I'm talking from Beckley, where we spent some wonderful times with Ann and Sasha, and just having the most deep and delightful time. Sasha was a scientist more in the ancient classical world, or the 19th century style. He didn't go for diplomas and positions, but he thought independently and experimented on himself. Of course, with psychedelics and changing things that change the psyche, in a sense, one has to experiment on oneself to know what the changes are. One can look at them in brain imaging terms, but that comes secondary to understanding how these strange substances manage to change human consciousness so deeply. And that is what he did. He was a deep explorer of new areas. I loved Sasha's passion for sharing his great knowledge. He had the kind of schoolboy's enthusiasm for trying to transmit his love of these drawings of compounds. And I remember so well him poring over a manuscript with Cosmo and trying to lead him into a love of how these chemicals can link and change human consciousness. He was very much an intellectual giant who didn't show his wares at all. It was all disguised behind the joker. Courteous, considerate and humble. He was a wonderful man. And because after all, the exploration of one's own consciousness must be the most basic of human rights. Sasha's legacy is incredibly important. It's so brilliant of Sasha not only to live his life perfectly, but also have a perfect death, surrounded by the people he loves, holding every moment. Well, I think he's a wonderful example to us all.
When I first met Sasha, I was 17 years old. I didn't really get his humor. He didn't smile very much, and I thought he was perhaps a little too serious and too grumpy. And I thought he was the last thing my mother needed. But I was wrong. It wasn't really that he was serious or grumpy at all. As my mother told me, he really wanted to fix his teeth. He was embarrassed about his smile. And when I found that out, I had a whole other feeling about him. Sasha was warm and funny, and a little bit awkward and shy in his own way. He did get his teeth fixed eventually, and he smiled a lot more after that. I worked with Sasha for about 10 years in the office and in the lab, sometimes working on the house or fixing the cactus garden. He was so easy to be with. Sometimes we would go out on errands, and I have a little story I want to tell you, one of these funny little Sasha-isms. When we would go to check out at the register, Sasha would pull out his big wallet with his checkbook, and he would pause and he would look at the person behind the counter and say, "Will you take my passport for ID?" And the person would say, "No, I need to see a driver's license, please." And with a twinkle in his eye, he would say, "But why not? This is a passport. It's an official identification. I should be able to use this." "Do you have a passport? Is it current?" he would ask the person. Usually they would say no. "What if you had to leave the country in a hurry? What would you do?" And then he would chuckle and pay the bill and say thank you and leave. He would always leave them wondering what to think, but I bet they made him think. He made them think. He also always carried a copy of the Bill of Rights in his wallet. I loved the way Sasha interacted with people. He was respectful and kind, and he was very fun to be around. I feel blessed that he was in my life. He was a wonderful person to know and to love.
In 1948, I graduated from Berkeley High School and entered UC Berkeley. The university set aside 2 rooms in the basement of California Hall for Phi Beta Kappa students and honor students to meet and to mingle. That's where I met Sasha and Nina, his wife-to-be, and Dale Gross, my wonderful husband-to-be. We became good friends. Sasha was a wonderful human being, so smart, so clever, and always so funny with his jokes and puns and limericks. There were always some elicited groans over his jokes. But he also was a chemist par excellence. What a privilege it was to know Sasha, to be in his presence. He was a wonderful, wonderful human being.
Good afternoon. 36 years 9 months and 6 days ago, I was a newly minted graduate student starting my PhD program here at Berkeley. I read in the Berkeley Bar about a conference that was going to take place in Washington State, the Second International Conference on Hallucinogenic Mushrooms. I didn't even think that such conferences existed, but I figured I had to be there. So I drove myself up, and on a Friday evening, the first social gathering of this meeting, got my glass of cheap red wine, walked up to the first three gentlemen that I saw standing there. The one in the middle stood out like a beacon on fire. Tall, skinny gentleman, wild shock of gray hair, and a big toothy grin. Well, he introduced himself as Alexander, call me Sasha Shulgin. And he changed my life very fundamentally. I may have not have had a continuous relationship with him, but I had many, many hours where I could watch him answering questions, talking to people who thronged to see the great Dr. Shulgin. He taught me a great deal about how to be as a scientist, how to be as someone who sought truth. I was very, very fortunate in his later years to be able to work with him a bit more closely, to help him with writing projects, to help restore his lab and bring it back to life. And it breaks my heart that we're missing him now. But somehow, it seems that Sasha Shulgin is out tripping in the cosmos somewhere. And somehow, I also have the feeling that I'll be running into him again, and I'll probably recognize him in whatever form he's taken. So I just wanted to let Sasha know I'm keeping my eye out. Thank you.
I met Sasha about 40 years ago when I was a postdoc at UC San Francisco. I remember vividly when he told me about his series of 10 ladies. These are not real women. They're phenethylamines that he gave women's names to. They're related to DOM, also known as STP. The relationship is that each one has a methyl group added to a different position on the DOM molecule. One of these ladies, named Ariadne, has antidepressant properties. It's not psychedelic. In fact, Ariadne made it into clinical trials with a major pharmaceutical company. I expect that many such discoveries are waiting to be made, and Sasha's work could provide the inspiration. Thank you.
The last 25 years, I've had many opportunities to meet with Sasha and to appreciate his enormous contributions to our field and to the lives of countless beneficiaries of his remarkable discoveries and insights. While not the original discoverer of MDMA, he was the first to appreciate its vast potential as an adjunct and facilitator of a distinctly novel form of psychotherapy. Sasha's introduction of MDMA to his friend and retired psychotherapist Leo Zeff in 1976, and his landmark 1978 article on the human pharmacology of MDMA, co-authored with David Nichols, catalyzed a wave of scientific and lay interest in the range of effects of phenethylamine compounds that persist to this present day. Over these many years, I have found Sasha a great source of inspiration and a courageous role model for speaking the truth and challenging politically motivated and often dishonest and deceptive scientific gospel. While the generations that follow Sasha will surely miss his genius, his creativity, and his remarkable sense of humor, the world will be a richer place for the many contributions.
Hi, I'd like to offer another riff on Sasha's science. So most discoveries in science occur when there's a confluence of knowledge and technology that make it ripe for them to happen. If such and such a person hadn't discovered something, then somebody else probably would have sometime soon. Some discoveries are different, though, like Albert Einstein and general relativity. If he hadn't thought of this, it's a good chance nobody else would have. And if Sasha had not done the work he did, it's likely that a vast landscape of pharmaceutical chemistry would have gone undiscovered, uncharted. Sasha's work is, by all objective criteria, worthy of the very highest academic honors, Nobel Prize kind of stuff. But such honors are impossible as we struggle as a society to learn how to balance the complexities that are stirred up by the power of psychedelics. What's true is this: some kinds of work are simply too big for universities, for government research institutes, and for industries, impressive as these institutions are. Sasha's work was like this. It was too big to be done in a multi-million-dollar laboratory. It instead required an alchemist's den, a courageous spirit, a careful focus of intention, and a goodly dose of mystical insight. Then the stuff of legend happened. Thank you, Sasha.
Hello, everyone. It's so great to be here on stage with Sasha's more prickly friends. I was so blessed that Wendy fell in love with Jason because I was able to take over her job and start working for Sasha about 10.5 years ago. Every morning he would greet me with a cup of coffee and a smile as we enjoyed classical music playing in the background. His childlike curiosity for discovery was contagious. It was one of the things that made him a great teacher and scientist. He was incredibly passionate about his work, but when Ann walked in the room, he would drop everything and ask, "What can I do for you, my love?" And then they would have their kiss of the morning. A couple of years later, Sasha and Ann invited us to live at the farm. I will always remember him putting his arm around Greg and saying, "You are family now." We were completely honest with one another. He was the greatest boss, teacher, and one of the best friends I ever had. His desire to connect and play with people made it so fun to be with him as he held court at conferences, events, and parties. Sasha and Ann taught me how to make friends with my shadow and deepen my understanding of the world around me and within me. Thank you all for helping us take such good care of Sasha. Your support made a huge difference. Sasha's spirit and legacy live on, and on lives the tribe. Thank you.
We are all here because Sasha had a very personal and intimate effect on our lives, and we are grateful. Tanya and I have been blessed with the privilege of living on the farm with Sasha and Ann, and we are so very grateful. And boy, do we have some stories to tell. I remember the first time Sasha took me out to the lab and instructed me to sit down and describe my thoughts as he opened a succession of test tubes for me to smell. He asked me if I believed that those thoughts and memories and feelings came from within those test tubes. Of course not, I said. And that's the point, he said. All I am is a tool maker. People use my tools to unlock doors and access rooms full of knowledge and wisdom and spirituality that already exist within them. I am just a tool maker. Fast forward to last year. One afternoon, during the early stages of Sasha's dementia, sitting around the dining room table, I asked Sasha to repeat something that he had just said, and he said, "Oops, can't remember." I said, "How does that feel, Sasha, to not have all that stuff running around in your brain anymore?" Sasha said, It's very freeing. I am in shy amazement of the world in front of me that I haven't touched yet. Thank you, Sasha. Your heart and humility and generosity and playfulness have taught me to be a better person. I love you and I miss you, my friend.
There are so many things to admire about Sasha, so I will speak of the one that always warms my heart, and that is his love and devotion to Ann. From the day I met them, it was always Ann and Sasha. The biggest smile would come across his face the moment he heard her voice, and even bigger when she came in the room. He was and still is the happiest man in the world. And when he could walk with his cane, he would always walk up to the car to meet Ann every time she came home. This man has so much love, and now and forever, it will be shared amongst us. I could say, may he rest in peace, but I don't think that's Sasha. I think God was licking his lips, waiting for Sasha to come back and create some new potions. God bless Sasha and Ann and everyone. Thank you.
Greetings, salutations, and aloha from the Big Island of Hawaii. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you, to pay tribute to a very, very dear man, our eternal ally, Sasha, and his lovely wife, Ann. Truly a couple for evolution. Many years ago, a very excited Leo Zeph shared a new substance he called Adam. He introduced us to his friend Sasha, and it was on a Wednesday night dinners that we got to know and love Sasha and Ann.
Sasha was a very dear friend, and we had a relationship like I knew he loved me and I loved him. And it was really beyond words. After moving to Hawaii, Sasha and I would have a kind of a word game, and he would love to drink cheap red wine, and we would enjoy jokes together, and we would string vowels together to make long Hawaiian names, and just giggle and have a lot of fun with that. Lately, as I was thinking about, so what are we going to say here and do here, I kept getting these kind of nudges from the other side, and I was remembering that how much Sasha enjoyed word games. So things began to just come through my mind, and I began to see and put together one word, and it was a consonant, two consonants, and a vowel. And it made the word W-O-W. Wow. Thank you, Sasha. Wow. What gift you have given us. We're forever grateful.
I've done MDMA twice. The first time was in 1998, and yeah, it was profound. It was kind of profound in almost a cliche sort of way. I was taken up into this glowing, fiery, benevolent... It sounds ridiculous. There are no words to describe what it was like. And yeah, it was amazing. But in subsequent years, I didn't want to talk about it. I discounted it as meaning anything because I was on drugs. How could it mean anything? So 15 years has gone by, and I have a profound belief in an other. There's something else. And it all goes back to that one time. That's all. That's real.
Today, I'm a vice president at Google. 30 years ago, I was a kid in the Midwest who knew there must be something more. And like many of us, my journey began with psychedelic chemistry. And Bob asked us to imagine a world where these experiences that are so valuable to all of us are widely available and supported. But I think many of us can remember a world even 30 years ago where these were scarcely available and definitely unsupported. And when I think of Sasha's work, I think not only of the brilliant chemistry, but also the contribution in legitimizing these experiences, making them supported, shedding the stigma, shedding the misunderstanding of society, and making them open and available to people who are genuinely curious and want to know who they are. So on behalf of one kid in the Midwest and all of us who know, thank you. And especially on behalf of those of society who do not yet know, perhaps even more so, thank you, Sasha, for this brave, important, courageous work.
Sasha Shulgin was, perhaps, the last Renaissance man. Citizen scientist working in a shed out in the yard, fueled by his curiosity, the love of the truth. The fruits of his labor revealed how much we do not understand. Like Socrates and Galileo before him, he penetrated deeply enough into the mystery to reveal that we are not as solid as we seem. When our cherished illusions are threatened, the psyche experiences anxiety and responds with repression, the ego's attempt to manufacture safety. Sasha was after the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. The fall from Eden is commonly misconstrued. Only by eating the fruit of duality do we enter the phenomenal world. This is no sin, but rather the necessary prerequisite for human existence. The truth is, we are in Eden still, for there is no place outside the garden of God. The ego is the vehicle through which the divine may live in the world. The human being is a peculiar animal, the one who forgets what it is. We need the ego to live in the world, but we become lost inside it, and our anxiety prevents us from seeing this. Sasha's work was about catalyzing the deepest longing of the human heart, to know itself. Sasha's allegiance was to the truth. He served no other master. Every human being must undergo ego death, at physical death, if not before. Sasha systematically developed technology dedicated to facilitating this evolution. Perhaps one day, pharmacological self-determination will be a human right.
We've had the honor of knowing Sasha and Ann for almost 20 years. And when we were asked to say some words today, a few memories jumped to mind to share.
One was that Sasha was really a very gracious celebrity. We first met Sasha and Ann at the Entheobotany Conference in 1996 in San Francisco, and we had just started Arrowhead about a year earlier. We were super excited to meet the authors of PiHKAL.
It was a bit of a chaotic scene as we joined with other young drug geeks clustering around Dr. Shulgin to talk about psychoactive chemistry, pharmacology, and experience. And he happily chatted with anyone who approached him, drawing dirty pictures, answering questions, and of course making puns.
But despite just being the center of attention and one of the stars of the show, he engaged each person, focusing his attention on their questions and becoming genuinely interested in what they were saying.
Earth and I have frequently discussed in the years since how graciously both Sasha and Ann handled talking to excited fans, often answering the same questions repeatedly year after year, with patience and humor, and they became role models for us in how to talk with audiences and fans of Arrowwood.
Another thing that really comes to mind when we think of Sasha and Ann together is how they worked as a team.
At that same Entheobotany conference, I was so nervous, approached Sasha and asked him to sign my copy of PiHKAL. I think he was the first author I ever asked to sign a book. And his response was that I should ask Ann to sign it first and then come back and get him to sign it. And although the meaning of that gesture might be lost on some people, it was really striking for me. As a part of a couple that works as a team, I had already experienced people assuming that Earth, as the male, was the lead of the project. And Sasha's response to my request for his signature showed me that he and Ann were committed to working as a team, as Earth and I do.
Sasha was really a dedicated teacher. When we met Sasha, we were just in our early 20s, and he was 70. At the time, our knowledge of chemistry and pharmacology was pretty limited. But over the past 20 years, as we attended social gatherings and presented at conference together with Ann and Sasha around the world, Sasha was always extremely generous with his time and knowledge.
In fact, I often joke that everything I know about chemistry I learned from Sasha drawing dirty pictures in the air.
Sasha was extremely generous in that he was always making himself available to us, whether to answer chemistry questions by phone or email or having lunch with us at their house, where we had wide-ranging discussions about politics and pharmacology,
or if he was offered to sign books or posters to help fundraise for Arrowwood. And we're also immensely grateful for Sasha and Ann's willingness to help us, to allow us to help them archive some of the notebooks and materials of Sasha's from his lab work.
Perhaps most important to the wider community, they also offered their home and created other spaces as a meeting place for drug geeks and people who are interested in the topics.
They've acted as a community hub for people interested in all aspects of psychedelics and pathogens, whether technical, recreational, or spiritual.
My father always said to me that in order to stay fully connected to the world, you need to keep and make friends of all ages. That there always needs to be an array of ages that some people at.
And gatherings at the Shulgins' home always included an amazing array of students, teachers, professionals, researchers, and policymakers from young to old. And since we've met Sasha and Ann 20 years ago, we've been thrilled to move ourselves from being acquaintances to junior colleagues to friends. And we'll miss you, Sasha. And we love you, Ann.
Lots of speakers today have talked about Sasha's playfulness. He enjoyed laughter himself. He could instigate laughter in others, and sometimes at the expense of others if they were particularly pompous. Sasha loved jokes and wordplay and was a collector of palindromes. He also knew a great many limericks and wrote quite a few, like this one. When Lady Chatterley swoons, her breasts pop up like balloons. But her butler stands by with hauteur in his eye and pops them back in with warm spoons. Another favorite humor style was the paraprosdokian, a kind of inside-out wordplay. I told my doctor that I broke my arm in 2 places. He told me not to go to those places. I've had a wonderful evening. Unfortunately, this wasn't it. Sasha had the excellent talent of delivery with diversion, and he loved to catch us off guard. Gandhi walked barefoot most of the time, which produced an impressive set of calluses on his feet. He also ate very little, which made him rather frail, and with his odd diet, he suffered from bad breath. This made him a super-calloused, fragile mystic hexed by halitosis. Sasha could synthesize something that had never existed anywhere in the universe before, find out what it does, and bring back the results for their potential benefit to the community, and do it with wit. I'd like to take a moment to give a thought to the possible messages or communications to this group that Sasha's prickly friends might have for us. I won't actually hold a microphone up to them, but we all know that they may have something that they would like for us to know. So let's just take a couple of breaths to listen to them. Every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. This gathering has been a remarkable mixture of the public and the private, the worldly and the sacred, the revealed and the concealed. Some of us have told stories that have been previously held secret. But during the course of Sasha's lifetime, there have been remarkable and radical shifts on what is or can be said about the use of his discoveries. Although conservatism has dominated decades of electoral politics, it has not been able to entice the genie of pluralism back into the bottle. According to some, attaching disgrace to psychedelic drug use is a hidden keystone of the campaign to smear the entire range of liberatory idealism that decades ago gave hope, heart, and character to my generation. Whether or not this is so, the concept that taking psychedelic drugs could be benign and even beneficial has been politically extremely unpopular in recent American history, although it has been a popular view for millennia. Still, many of us know that the insights, ideals, and commitments that we brought home from psychedelic experience have contributed to our formation as socially responsible, ethical, and humane citizens. While there may be a discrepancy between the ideals and insights that we connect to our psychedelic experiences and the values and commitments that structure our everyday lives, I suspect that for many of us, our ethics, our spiritual beliefs, and our daily practices have been formed by the insights derived from our psychedelic experiences. I know that mine certainly have. In my research, experienced users of psychedelic drugs related to me their experiences of interconnectedness with nature, with the deity, and with others. And many describe how these experiences have led them to engage in political activism, to take up philanthropy, to undertake ecological restoration, or to enter public service. Their psychedelic experiences did not encourage these people to turn away from social responsibilities, but seemed to have moved them to become more involved in caring for the community and for the natural environment. As a group, I feel us to be culturally and politically vital. If, as I suspect is true, our psychedelic experiences have had lifelong implications not only for our personal growth and our spiritual development, but also for our community involvement and our political activism, we should stand up and claim those experiences as influential in our lives. And we have not even to make the journey alone, because the heroes of all time have gone before us. And where we had thought to find an abomination, we will find a God. And where we had thought to slay another, we will slay ourselves. And where we had thought to travel outwardly, we will travel to the center of our own existence. And where we had thought to be alone, we will be with all the world. Thank you.
A circle in a spiral, like a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning on a never spinning reel, like a snowball down a mountain or a carnival balloon, like a carousel that's turning, running rings around the moon, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its face, and the world is like an apple whirling silently in space, like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind. Like a tunnel that you follow to a tunnel of its own, down a hollow to a cavern where the sun has never shone, like a door that keeps revolving in a half-forgotten dream, or the ripples from a pebble someone tosses in a stream, like a clock whose hands are sweeping past the minutes of its face, And the world is like an apple whirling silently in space, like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind. Keys that jingle in your pocket, words that jangle in your head. Why did summer go so quickly? Was it something that you said? Lovers walk along the shore and leave their footprints in the sand. Is the sound of distant drumming just the fingers of your hand? Pictures hanging in a hallway and a fragment of a song. Half remembered names and faces, but to whom do they belong? When you knew that it was over, you were suddenly aware that the autumn leaves were turning to the color of her hair. A circle in a spiral, a wheel within a wheel, never ending or beginning on an ever-spinning reel, as the images unwind like the circles that you find in the windmills of your mind.